If Hawk finds me tonight, I lose everything. The rain hit the pavement hard enough to sting, cold drops slicing through the thin fabric of Milan's jacket as he ran, his breath uneven, chest tight. One hand locked protectively over his lower abdomen, as if he could shield what was growing inside him from the world chasing at his back. From the past, he was trying to outrun. The gravel road stretched ahead in a long, dark line, slick and treacherous, every step threatening to send him slipping. But he forced himself forward anyway, ignoring the burn in his legs, the ache building in his lungs, the quiet pulse of discomfort beneath his palm that reminded him he was no longer running alone. A distant engine growled somewhere behind him, low and unmistakable, and his heart lurched violently, panic surging through him so fast it almost made him dizzy. Because there was only one person who would come looking like that. Only one person who would not stop once he decided something belonged to him. "Keep going," Milan whispered, though the words broke apart in the wind, barely sound at all, more a plea than a command. The headlights appeared a moment later, cutting through the darkness like a blade, sweeping across the road. Too close, too fast. An instinct took over before thought could catch up, his body veering sharply off the road as he stumbled down into the shallow ditch. Mud soaking through his shoes as he crouched low, pressing himself against the wet earth, forcing his breathing to quiet, to slow, to disappear. The light passed over the empty road where he had been seconds ago, lingering just long enough to make his pulse spike again, before finally moving on, the sound of the engine fading inch by inch until the night swallowed it completely. Milan didn't move. He stayed there, frozen, counting each second in silence, waiting for the sound to return, for footsteps, for a voice, for anything that meant he had been found anyway. Nothing came. Only rain, softer now, tapping steadily against the ground, against his shoulders, against his trembling hands. Slowly, carefully, he exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening just enough for him to breathe again. Though the fear didn't leave, it never really did, not anymore. His fingers tightened instinctively over his stomach, pressing in slightly as if he needed to feel something real, something steady. "You're okay," he murmured under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for himself or for the tiny life he was carrying, the one thing in this world that wasn't borrowed, wasn't temporary, wasn't something that could be taken and replaced. Because everything else had been. Milan pushed himself upright, wincing as his legs protested, the cold seeping into his bones, his body already stretched thin from days of running, from nights without rest, from the quiet, constant strain he refused to acknowledge out loud. He climbed back onto the road slowly, glancing once over his shoulder into the darkness he had come from, his gaze lingering just a second too long before he forced himself to turn away again. Somewhere behind him was a small house that never quite felt like home, with its uneven floors and the faint smell of wood and smoke, a place where silence had weight and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. A place where Hawk lived. The thought hit harder than the cold, sharper than the fear, something complicated twisting in his chest that he immediately tried to push down, to bury, to ignore. It doesn't matter, he told himself firmly, his jaw tightening as he started forward again, one step, then another, each one a deliberate choice not to turn back. It had never been his place. He had known that from the beginning. The clean sheets that weren't meant for him, the quiet preparations that belonged to someone else, the name that was never spoken, but always there. Bella. Milan swallowed hard, the taste of it bitter even in memory, his grip tightening on his jacket as if he could hold himself together through sheer force. "Debt repaid," he whispered, the words steady this time. Practiced, the only explanation he had allowed himself to leave behind, the only truth he believed he was owed. It should have been enough. It had to be, because staying would have meant accepting something he was never meant to have, something that was never his. Another sharp ache curled low in his abdomen, subtle but undeniable, and he paused for just a moment, closing his eyes as he pressed his hand more firmly against his stomach, breathing through it, grounding himself in the one thing that hadn't been a mistake. "I won't. Let him take you," Milan said softly, the words quiet but certain, stronger than anything else he had said that night. The rain eased into a light drizzle, the road ahead stretching into darkness, unknown and uncertain, but Milan didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward, leaving everything behind him, and didn't look back again. I wasn't worth keeping, just worth paying for. Milan understood that long before the paper was placed in front of him, long before the pen was pushed across the table, long before anyone bothered to explain what was already decided. The kitchen felt smaller that morning, the air thick and unmoving, as if even the walls were waiting for him to finish something they had already accepted as inevitable. His father sat at the table with a quiet kind of impatience, one hand resting beside a stack of papers, the other tapping lightly against the wood in a slow, steady rhythm that seemed louder than it should have been. His stepmother didn't sit at all. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, watching Milan the way someone might watch a problem they were finally about to solve. "Sign it," his father said, not looking at him, not needing to. Milan stayed where he was, fingers curling slightly against his palm, his gaze drifting down to the paper despite himself. He had read it already. The words hadn't changed. They still carried the same clean, distant tone that made everything sound official, reasonable, like this was just an agreement between people who mattered. Contract, transfer, compensation. It almost sounded like a job. Almost. "What happens if I don't?" Milan asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it, fragile and thin in a room that had no space for it. His stepmother's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "You think you're in a position to refuse," she said, her voice soft in a way that made it worse. "Look around you. Everything you've eaten, everything you've used, everything you owe, this is how it gets paid back. Debt." The words settled into him the way it always did, heavy and familiar, something that had been passed down to him like it belonged there, like it was part of who he was. His father finally looked up then, his expression flat, already finished with the conversation. "We're not asking you," he said. Milan felt something tighten in his chest, something small and instinctive that wanted to push back, to say no, to walk away, but it faded just as quickly as it came, worn down by years of knowing exactly how much that kind of resistance was worth. Nothing. His gaze dropped back to the paper, to the empty line at the bottom, and for a moment, he just stood there, caught between the person he might have been and the one they had already decided he was. The sound of the door opening cut through the silence, sharp enough to make all of them turn. The man who stepped inside didn't belong in a place like this. Milan could tell that immediately, not because of what he wore, which was simple, practical, nothing that stood out, but because of how he carried himself, steady, grounded, like the space adjusted around him instead of the other way around. Hawk. The name surfaced in Milan's mind with a quiet sense of recognition, pulled from half-heard conversations and unfinished sentences that always stopped when he got too close. Seeing him now felt different, real in a way that made Milan instinctively straighten, even though he didn't mean to. Hawk's gaze moved across the room once, brief and assessing, before it settled on Milan. It didn't linger out of curiosity. It didn't soften. It simply stopped, like it had reached exactly where it was meant to be. Milan felt it immediately, the weight of that attention, the way it seemed to see through the room, through the situation, through him, and decide something without needing confirmation. "You're late," his father said, but there was a shift in his tone now, subtle but undeniable. Hawk didn't answer. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the comment at all. Instead, he stepped forward and placed a stack of cash on the table. The sound was soft, controlled, but it changed everything. The tapping stopped. The air shifted. Milan's stepmother straightened without realizing it. "Count it," Hawk said, his voice low, even, not a request, not a suggestion, just a direction. His father did, quickly, efficiently, the numbers clearly matching whatever he expected, because his expression settled into something satisfied, something final. "It's all here," he said. Hawk gave a small nod, then looked back at Milan, completely unconcerned with the paper still sitting on the table. "I don't need the contract," he said. The words landed quietly, but they carried more weight than anything else that had been said. Milan blinked, his breath catching slightly, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. This had never been about the paper. It had never been about agreement. It had been decided the moment Hawk walked through the door. "He's mine," Hawk added, just as simply as before, the statement steady, absolute, like he was naming something that already belonged to him. Milan felt the world narrow slightly around those words, the room fading at the edges as something settled into place deep inside him, something cold and certain. Mine. Not asked. Not negotiated. Just taken. His fingers trembled as he reached for the pen anyway, the motion automatic, almost meaningless now, but he finished it, his name forming in careful strokes that felt too small for what they represented. When he set the pen down, the sound was barely there, but it marked the end of something all the same. Hawk didn't look at the paper. He didn't need to. His attention never left Milan, steady, unwavering, like nothing about this moment was uncertain. Come on, Hawk said, already turning toward the door, as if the next step was obvious, as if there was nothing left to consider. Milan hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking around the room, taking in the worn table, the cracked tiles, the place he had spent his entire life in without ever belonging to it. No one stopped him. No one spoke. There was no hesitation, no regret, no second thought. He had already been given away long before today. Milan exhaled quietly, something inside him settling into a calm that didn't feel like peace so much as acceptance. And then he stepped forward, following the man who had claimed him without asking who he was, leaving behind a life that had never once asked him to stay. The first thing I noticed about Hawk's house was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet Milan had imagined, not the kind that felt safe or warm, but something heavier, something that pressed in from all sides the moment he stepped out of the truck and onto the uneven ground in front of it, like the air itself had settled into stillness and refused to move. The house sat a little off the road, surrounded by open land that stretched farther than Milan was used to seeing, patches of dry grass shifting faintly in the wind, a wooden fence leaning slightly where time had worn it down. It wasn't large. It wasn't impressive, but it stood there solid and unmoving, like it had no intention of changing for anyone. Hawk didn't say anything as he walked ahead, his steps steady, unhurried, as if he expected Milan to follow without being told. And Milan did. He didn't know what else to do. The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they climbed up to the front door, the sound sharp in the quiet, and when Hawk pushed it open, the inside of the house greeted them with the same stillness, the same sense that everything inside had been left exactly as it was, untouched, waiting. Milan hesitated for a fraction of a second on the threshold before stepping in, his eyes moving instinctively, taking in the space without meaning to. A small living area, a worn couch, a table with only one chair pushed neatly in. Everything was clean, but not in a careful, decorative way, more like things were kept in order because there was no one else there to disturb them. Upstairs, Hawk said, his voice low, cutting through the silence just enough to guide without explaining. Milan nodded, even though Hawk wasn't looking at him, and moved toward the narrow staircase at the back of the room, his hand brushing lightly against the railing as he climbed. The wood was smooth from use, familiar in a way that made something tighten quietly in his chest, though he didn't understand why. The hallway at the top was short, only 2 doors, one slightly ajar, the other closed. Hawk moved past him without pause, pushing open the door at the end of the hall and stepping inside. Milan followed more slowly, his steps softer, cautious, as if he were entering a space he wasn't supposed to see. The room was different. That was the first thing he noticed. It didn't match the rest of the house. The bed was neatly made with clean, pale sheets, untouched, the surface smooth and unwrinkled like no one had ever slept in it. A small table stood beside it, holding a lamp that looked newer than anything downstairs, and on the opposite wall, a narrow closet stood slightly open, revealing a few carefully folded pieces of clothing inside, untouched and used. Milan stopped just inside the doorway, his gaze lingering on the details, the quiet order of it all, the sense that this room had been prepared, not lived in. Not for him. The realization settled slowly, but firmly. Hawk stepped further inside, glancing around once as if checking something, then nodded to himself in a small, almost imperceptible way. "You'll stay here," he said. Milan swallowed, his fingers curling slightly at his sides as he stepped in fully, the door closing softly behind him. "It's nice," he said, the words automatic, polite, even though they didn't quite fit what he was feeling. Nice wasn't the right word. This room wasn't warm. It wasn't welcoming. It felt reserved, like it was waiting. Hawk didn't respond to the comment. His gaze flicked briefly to Milan, then away, as if the room mattered more than the person standing in it. "Don't touch anything you don't need," he added after a moment, his tone not harsh, but firm enough that it didn't sound like a suggestion. Milan nodded again, quieter this time. "Okay." His eyes drifted once more across the room, lingering on the bed, the untouched sheets, the absence of anything personal, anything that suggested someone had actually lived there. It felt like stepping into someone else's place. Someone who wasn't here. Someone who might come back. Who was this for? The question slipped out before he could stop it, soft, uncertain, almost swallowed by the quiet between them. Hawk paused, just for a second. It was small, barely noticeable, but Milan saw it anyway, the slight stillness, the way his shoulders shifted just enough to mark the change. Then it was gone. Someone who isn't coming back, Hawk said. His voice didn't change. It stayed level, controlled, but something in the answer settled deeper than the words themselves. Milan nodded slowly. Even though the explanation didn't really explain anything, even though it left more questions than it answered. He didn't ask again. He had learned when not to. Hawk turned toward the door, already moving on from the conversation. Get settled, he said. I'll be downstairs. And then he left, the sound of his footsteps fading down the stairs until the house returned to that same heavy, unmoving silence. Milan stood there for a moment longer, alone in a room that didn't belong to him, his eyes tracing the edges of it again, slower this time, more deliberate. The bed, the folded clothes, the untouched air. Someone else had been meant to stand here. Someone else had been meant to stay. He stepped forward carefully, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the blanket, the fabric cool beneath his skin, untouched, waiting. Not mine, he murmured under his breath, the words quiet, almost lost in the stillness of the room. But he didn't step back. He didn't leave. Because even if it wasn't his, even if it never would be, it was where he had been placed. And for now, that was enough. I thought the worst part would be what he might do. I didn't expect it to be what he didn't. Milan stayed sitting on the edge of the bed long after Hawk left, his hands resting stiffly in his lap, his back straight like he was still standing in that kitchen, still waiting for instructions that had already been decided for him. The room hadn't changed, but it felt different now, quieter in a way that made every small sound sharper. The faint ticking of something unseen, the soft whisper of wind against the window, the distant creak of the house settling around him. He lay down eventually, carefully, like he was placing himself somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, his body tense even against the softness of the mattress, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if sleep might come if he stayed still enough. It didn't. Time stretched, slow and uneven, his thoughts refusing to quiet, circling back again and again to the same question he didn't know how to answer. What happens now? The door opened without warning. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to break the silence. Milan's entire body tensed instantly, his breath catching as he turned his head, his fingers gripping the blanket before he could stop himself. Hawk stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, his silhouette steady against the dim light from the hall. He didn't speak. He didn't move right away. He just looked at Milan, his gaze fixed, unreadable, as if he was taking in something that didn't need to be explained. Milan pushed himself up quickly, sitting straight, his shoulders tight, his pulse loud in his ears. Did I do something wrong? The question came out softer than he meant it to, edged with something he couldn't quite hide. Hawk's expression didn't change. No, he said, his voice low even. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the quiet click echoing through the room like a decision being made. Milan felt the space shift immediately, smaller, closer, the air heavier than before. Hawk moved forward slowly, his steps measured, deliberate, stopping just close enough that Milan could feel his presence without being touched. It was worse like this, Milan realized, worse not knowing, worse waiting. His body reacted before his thoughts could catch up, shoulders tightening, breath shallow, his hands pressing into the mattress like he needed something to hold on to. Hawk noticed. Of course he did. His gaze dropped briefly to Milan's hands, then back to his face, something sharper flickering there for just a second. You look like you're bracing, Hawk said. Not accusing, not mocking, just stating it. Milan swallowed, his throat tight. I don't know what you expect, he admitted, his voice unsteady despite himself. The words hung there between them, fragile and exposed. For a moment, Hawk didn't respond. He just stood there, watching him, the silence stretching just enough to make Milan's chest tighten further, his thoughts racing ahead of him, filling in possibilities he didn't want to name. Then Hawk moved. Not fast, not sudden, just enough to close the distance. Milan flinched before he could stop himself, the reaction small but real, his body betraying him in a way he couldn't control. Hawk's hand lifted, and for a split second, Milan's breath stopped completely, his muscles locking, his mind blank except for the instinctive anticipation of something he had already prepared himself for. But it didn't come. Hawk's hand paused midair, then shifted, his fingers brushing lightly against Milan's sleeve instead, a brief, controlled contact that was almost careful. Milan froze anyway, his body caught between relief and confusion, his shoulders still tense, his breath uneven. Hawk's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he was seeing something more clearly now. "Relax," he said quietly. It wasn't a command. It wasn't gentle either. It was just certain. Milan tried. He really did. But his body didn't listen right away, the tension lingering in his shoulders, in his hands, in the way he held himself like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Hawk's hand remained where it was for a moment longer, then settled more firmly against Milan's arm, steady, grounding, not forcing him down, not pulling him closer, just there, solid and present. Milan looked up at him then, his eyes searching, uncertain, trying to understand what this meant, what he was supposed to do with it. Hawk held his gaze for a second, longer than before, something shifting there, something quieter, less distant. "You don't have to wait for something bad to happen," Hawk said. Milan let out a small, shaky breath, the words sinking in slowly, unfamiliar in a way that made his chest ache. "I always do," he said before he could stop himself. The admission felt too honest the second it left him. Hawk didn't react the way Milan expected. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't question it. He just watched him for another second, then spoke, his voice lower this time, steadier. "Not here." The words settled into the space between them, simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Milan didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know how to believe it. But something in his body loosened anyway, just a fraction, his shoulders dropping slightly, his grip on the blanket easing without him realizing it. Hawk's hand shifted once more, his fingers brushing briefly over Milan's sleeve before pulling away completely. The loss of contact sudden enough that Milan noticed it more than he expected to. Hawk stepped back, the space between them returning, the pressure in the room easing just slightly. "Get some sleep," he said, already turning toward the door. Milan nodded. Even though Hawk wasn't looking, his gaze dropping to his hands as he tried to steady the strange, unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. Hawk paused at the door, just for a second, then added, without turning back, "You're staying. Don't overthink it." And then he left, the door closing softly behind him. The sound quieter this time, less final, but no less real. Milan sat there for a long moment after, unmoving, his mind replaying everything in fragments. The look, the pause, the almost touch, the words that didn't match what he had expected. Slowly, he lay back down, pulling the blanket over himself, his hand resting lightly against his chest, as if to steady something that had shifted inside him. The room was still quiet, still chushed, still not his. But as he closed his eyes, one thought lingered longer than the rest, softer, more dangerous. For the first time, he didn't know if he was more afraid of Hawk or of wanting to believe him. No one had ever fed me like this, and that scared me more than anything else. Milan woke slowly, not because he was rested, but because something unfamiliar had replaced the sharp edge of fear that usually dragged him awake. For a few seconds, he didn't move, his eyes half open, his body still, as if testing whether the quiet around him would break if he did. It didn't. The room remained unchanged, still, untouched, the pale morning light slipping through the window and settling softly across the bed. He was still here. The realization came gently this time, not as a shock, but as something quieter, something that lingered. Then he heard it, a steady, controlled sound from downstairs. Not loud, not chaotic, just consistent. Milan pushed himself up slowly, his body stiff, his mind catching up in fragments as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. For a moment, he just sat there, listening, his fingers curling lightly against the blanket as if grounding himself before stepping into something unknown. Then he stood, moving toward the door with quiet steps, his hand pausing on the handle before he opened it. The hallway was empty. The house felt the same, but not as heavy. Milan moved down the stairs carefully, each step measured, his senses sharper now, aware of everything, the faint scent in the air, the subtle warmth, the quiet rhythm of movement below. When he reached the bottom, he saw him. Hawk stood in the kitchen, back turned, one hand braced against the counter, the other moving with quiet precision, like every action had already been decided before it happened. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He just did. Milan stopped a few feet away, unsure where the line was, unsure where he was allowed to stand. "You're awake," Hawk said without turning. Milan blinked, caught off guard for a second before answering softly, yes. Hawk didn't respond immediately. He finished what he was doing first, setting something down, rinsing his hands, wiping the counter in a smooth, practiced motion before finally turning. His gaze landed on Milan briefly. Steady, assessing, then shifted toward the table. Sit. Milan obeyed without thinking, pulling the chair out slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might break something he didn't understand yet. He sat straight, his hands resting lightly in his lap, waiting. Hawk stepped closer, placing a plate in front of him without comment. The food was simple, warm, real. Milan stared at it for a second too long, something tightening in his chest in a way that felt unfamiliar and dangerously close to something else. Eat, Hawk said. Milan's fingers twitched slightly. I can make something, he said quickly, almost reflexively, his voice quiet but urgent, like he needed to offer something back, like taking without giving wasn't allowed. Hawk didn't react the way Milan expected. He didn't dismiss it harshly. He didn't ignore it. He just looked at him. You burned your hand yesterday. The words landed softly, but they hit harder than anything else. Milan's breath caught, his gaze dropping instinctively to his hand, then back up again, confusion flickering across his face before he could hide it. Hawk noticed. Of course he did. It's not nothing if it slows you down, Hawk added, his tone even, not scolding, not gentle, just certain. Milan didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever said something like that to him before. Not about him. Not like it mattered. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, his throat tightening as he forced himself to nod. Okay. Hawk didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Milan reached for the fork slowly, his movements careful, his posture still too stiff, too aware, like he was waiting for something to change. The first bite was small. He chewed quietly, his focus dropping to the plate, but his mind wasn't on the food. It was on the absence of something. No demand, no expectation, no immediate cost. It unsettled him more than anything else had. Hawk moved around the kitchen while he ate, not watching closely, not hovering, but present in a way that filled the space without crowding it. He rinsed a dish, adjusted something on the stove, wiped down a surface that didn't need it. Everything he did had a rhythm, steady, controlled, leaving no room for hesitation. Milan found himself watching without meaning to, his eyes tracking those small, deliberate movements, something quiet shifting in his chest. With each one, you don't have to sit like that. Milan froze slightly, the fork pausing midair. Like what? Hawk glanced at him, just briefly. Like you're about to be told to leave. The words were simple, direct, and completely accurate. Milan's grip tightened just a fraction, his gaze dropping again as something uncomfortable settled in his chest. I'm not, he said, though the words felt weak even to him. Hawk didn't argue. He didn't push. He just studied him for a second, then said, You are. No judgment, just truth. Milan didn't respond this time. He couldn't. Instead, he took another bite, slower now, more deliberate, his shoulders easing just slightly without him realizing it. The silence that followed felt different. Not empty, just shared. When he finished, he set the fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the plate without thinking, a habit he hadn't noticed forming until now. Thank you, he said quietly. The words felt heavier than they should have. Hawk stepped closer, stopping just within reach. Milan's body tensed automatically, but not as sharply as before, the reaction softer, slower. Hawk reached out, his hand pausing for a brief second before touching Milan's injured hand, his fingers brushing lightly over the reddened skin, checking, not claiming, not holding. Milan's breath caught, but he didn't pull away. He stayed still, watching, waiting, but not bracing the way he had before. Hawk's touch was brief, controlled, his expression unchanged as he assessed the mark. It'll heal, he said. Milan nodded, though he hadn't asked. Hawk's hand lingered for half a second longer than necessary before he pulled back, the absence of contact noticeable in a way Milan didn't expect. There's more if you're still hungry, Hawk added, already turning away. Milan watched him for a moment, something unfamiliar settling deeper this time, something quieter, more dangerous. Not fear. Not exactly. As he looked down at the empty plate, his fingers resting lightly against the table, one thought surfaced, clear and unsettling. If this was what staying felt like, leaving might not be the hardest part anymore. I didn't notice when I started watching him, only when I couldn't stop. It happened gradually, so quietly that Milan didn't recognize it at first, the way his attention began to drift, The way his eyes followed Hawk without meaning to, tracking small movements that didn't seem important until they became the only things he noticed. It started with routine, the sound of the door opening in the morning, the steady rhythm of footsteps crossing the floor, the way Hawk moved through the house like he already knew exactly where everything belonged, like nothing ever surprised him. Milan told himself it was just awareness, just caution, just making sure he understood the space he had been placed in. But it didn't feel like that anymore. Not when he found himself pausing in the middle of something just to listen for Hawk's presence. Not when silence felt different depending on whether Hawk was in the house or not. That morning, the air felt heavier, warmer, the sunlight sharper through the windows as Milan stood at the sink, carefully rinsing a cup, his injured hand held slightly away from the water, his movements slower, more deliberate. He had insisted on helping this time. Hawk hadn't argued. He had just watched him for a moment, then stepped aside, like it didn't matter either way. Milan focused on the task in front of him, but his awareness stretched beyond it, picking up on the quiet shift behind him, the subtle sound of Hawk moving closer. He didn't turn right away. He didn't need to. He could feel it. "You're favoring it," Hawk said, his voice low, close enough that Milan felt it more than heard it. Milan's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "It's fine," he replied, softer than he intended. There was a pause. Then, "It's not." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Milan swallowed, setting the cup down carefully, his hand lingering there for a second longer than necessary before he pulled it back. He turned then, slowly, his gaze lifting just enough to meet Hawk's for a brief moment before dropping again. Hawk was closer than he expected, close enough that Milan had to tilt his head slightly to look up at him, close enough that the space between them felt intentional. "Let me see it," Hawk said. Milan hesitated, not because he wanted to refuse, but because something about the request made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. Still, he lifted his hand slowly, offering it without argument. Hawk reached out, his movements controlled, his fingers wrapping lightly around Milan's wrist, steadying it before turning his hand slightly to examine the burn. The contact was brief, careful, but it grounded Milan in a way that caught him off guard. His breath slowed without him realizing it, his shoulders loosening just slightly as he watched Hawk's focus narrow, his attention fixed entirely on something as small as a mark on his skin. "You're not supposed to make it worse," Hawk said after a moment. Milan let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I'm not used to someone noticing," he admitted before he could stop himself. The words slipped out too easily, too honestly. Hawk's grip stilled for a fraction of a second. Then he let go, not abruptly, not carelessly, just enough that the absence of his touch was noticeable. "Get used to it," Hawk said, quieter this time. Milan didn't respond. He couldn't. Something about the way Hawk said it settled deeper than it should have, lingering in a place Milan wasn't ready to examine. He turned back to the sink, his movements slower now, more aware, his thoughts less steady than before. Hawk didn't move away immediately. Milan could feel him still there, just behind him, close enough that the air felt different, warmer, heavier. It made his hands less certain, his focus slipping in ways he wasn't used to. He reached for another cup, his fingers brushing the edge wrong, and it slipped. Not far, just enough to make a sharp sound against the sink. Milan flinched instinctively, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, his breath catching as he froze. Hawk moved before he could think. One hand steadied the cup. The other caught Milan's wrist again, firmer this time, stopping the motion before it could turn into something worse. Milan stilled completely. The contact was stronger now, more certain, less careful. Not rough, just undeniable. His pulse jumped, fast and sudden, the reaction immediate and impossible to ignore. Hawk didn't let go right away. His grip held for a second longer than necessary, his gaze dropping to Milan's hand, then lifting again, meeting his eyes. Milan felt it then. Not fear. Not exactly. Something sharper. Something warmer. Something he didn't recognize, but couldn't ignore. "You're distracted," Hawk said. Milan's throat tightened. "I'm not," he answered automatically, though the words lacked conviction. Hawk didn't argue. He didn't need to. His hand loosened slightly, but didn't leave entirely, his fingers still, resting lightly against Milan's wrist, grounding, present. "Then focus," he said. Milan nodded, though his attention had already shifted somewhere else entirely, caught in the space between them, in the way Hawk's presence filled it without effort, in the way his body reacted before he could control it. Hawk let go after another second, stepping back just enough to break the contact, the air shifting again as the distance returned. Milan exhaled slowly, only then realizing he had been holding his breath. He stared down at his hands, at the faint mark on his skin, at the place where Hawk had touched him, something unfamiliar lingering there long after the contact was gone. Finish what you started, Hawk said, already turning away. Milan nodded again, though his movements were slower now, more deliberate, his mind not entirely where it should have been. The water ran, the dishes stacked, the routine continued. But something had changed. He could feel it, in the way his chest felt tighter, in the way silence didn't feel empty anymore, in the way he was suddenly, painfully aware of where Hawk was in the room without needing to look. Milan set the last cup down carefully, his fingers lingering for a second before pulling away. He didn't turn around this time. He didn't need to. He already knew Hawk was still there. And for the first time, that didn't make him want to leave. That scared him more than anything else. I had felt this before. I knew what it meant. I just didn't want it to be real. It started as something easy to ignore, the kind of discomfort Milan had trained himself to live with, quiet, persistent, never loud enough to demand attention, but never fading either. He moved through the morning the way he always did, careful, controlled, keeping his hands busy, his thoughts somewhere else, but his body didn't follow. It lagged behind him, heavy in a way that didn't make sense, his breath catching at the wrong moments, his focus slipping in small, frustrating ways he couldn't explain. He told himself it would pass. It always did. But this didn't feel like anything that had come before. By midday, the unease had settled deeper, no longer something he could pretend wasn't there. It wasn't pain. Not exactly. It was awareness. A quiet, insistent reminder that something inside him had shifted, something he couldn't see but couldn't ignore. Milan stood at the sink, the water running over his hands, his gaze unfocused as his fingers moved automatically, rinsing, wiping, repeating motions he didn't have to think about. His other hand drifted lower again, resting lightly against his abdomen, the gesture instinctive, unconscious, as if his body already understood something his mind refused to accept. He stilled. The realization pressed in, slow but certain. Not yet. Not again. He turned the water off abruptly, the silence that followed too loud, too sudden. Milan. Hawk's voice cut through the space, low and steady, and Milan's body reacted before his thoughts did, his shoulders tightening, his hand dropping away too quickly. He turned, the movement uneven, his balance shifting just slightly as the room tilted for a second before settling again. Hawk was already close, closer than he expected. His gaze moved over Milan quickly, taking in the details, the tension, the slight unsteadiness he hadn't been able to hide. "You're pale," Hawk said. Milan shook his head immediately. "I'm fine." The words came too fast, too practiced. Hawk didn't answer. He stepped closer instead, his presence filling the space, grounding it, forcing Milan to stay where he was instead of retreating into the instinct to dismiss. His eyes dropped briefly, following the movement Milan hadn't meant to make, the way his hand had gone to his abdomen again without permission. When Hawk looked back up, something in his expression had changed. Sharper, more focused. Since when? It wasn't a question. It was a demand for truth. Milan froze. His throat tightened, his gaze dropping, his fingers curling slightly against his shirt. "It's nothing," he tried again, softer now. Hawk didn't move. "How long?" he said, his voice lower, more precise, leaving no space for avoidance. Milan hesitated. "Just a second." That was enough. Hawk saw it. Of course he did. "How long?" he repeated. Milan swallowed, his chest tightening as the answer settled into him, heavier now that it had to be said out loud. "A few days." The words barely made it out. Silence followed. Not empty, not passive. It held weight now, tension pressing into the space between them as Hawk's gaze dropped once more, slower this time, more deliberate, settling on the place Milan's hand had been protecting. Then it lifted again. "And you didn't say anything." Milan shook his head. Faintly, his voice quieter than before. "I didn't think it mattered." The truth of it sat between them, exposed, undeniable. For a moment, Hawk didn't respond. He just looked at him, something shifting behind his eyes, something deeper than irritation, deeper than concern. Then, simply, firmly, he said, "It matters." The words hit harder than they should have. Milan's breath caught, his thoughts stalling, something inside him reacting before he could understand why. Hawk stepped closer again, lifting his hand, his fingers settling around Milan's wrist, steady, grounding, not rough, not hesitant. Milan didn't pull away. He couldn't. Not with the way Hawk was looking at him now, like he wasn't something to overlook, like this wasn't something to dismiss. "Look at me," Hawk said quietly. Milan did. And for a moment, everything else disappeared. "We're getting it checked," Hawk said. Not asking, not offering, deciding. Milan shook his head slightly, the instinct still there, the habit of minimizing, of pushing things aside. "It's nothing," he tried again, though the words felt weaker now, less certain. Hawk didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Then we confirm that." Milan's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say. Hawk's grip loosened slightly, his thumb brushing once, briefly, against Milan's wrist before letting go, the absence of contact sharper than it should have been. "Sit," Hawk said. Milan obeyed, lowering himself into the nearest chair, his body heavier now, his thoughts quieter, like something inside him had shifted and taken up more space than before. Hawk moved quickly, efficiently, grabbing what he needed without hesitation, his actions decisive, leaving no room for doubt, no space for Milan to retreat back into denial. Milan watched him, something unfamiliar settling in his chest with every movement, something that felt dangerously close to relief. "Can you walk?" Hawk asked. Milan nodded, his voice delayed by a second. "Yes." Hawk studied him briefly, then nodded once, satisfied. He didn't reach for him again. He didn't need to. Milan stood on his own, slower this time, more aware of the weight inside him, of the quiet certainty he had tried to ignore. His hand moved back to his abdomen without thinking, pressing lightly, protectively. He knew. He had known from the moment the feeling started. From the moment his body changed in ways he couldn't explain. This wasn't unfamiliar. That was the part that made it worse. He paused for just a second, his breath catching as the truth settled fully, undeniable now. If it was what he thought, everything was about to change. And as he stepped toward the door, following Hawk without being told, one thought settled deeper than the rest, sharper than fear, heavier than uncertainty. He wasn't afraid of what Hawk would do. He was afraid of what it would mean if Hawk chose to stay. The moment she walked in, I understood what I had been standing in the middle of this entire time. Milan didn't hear the car at first. The house had its own rhythm now, a quiet pattern he had started to recognize, and anything outside of that took a moment longer to register. He was in the kitchen, his hand resting lightly against the counter, the other drifting unconsciously to his abdomen, a habit he no longer noticed. Hawk had stepped outside only minutes ago, saying nothing more than he would be back. Then came the sound. Tires against gravel. Not rushed, just certain. Milan stilled, his breath catching slightly as something in his chest tightened without explanation. He didn't move at first. He told himself it didn't matter, that this wasn't his place to question. But his body didn't listen. His gaze shifted toward the window anyway, his steps quiet as he moved just enough to see. The car was already there, the engine off, the door opening. She stepped out like she belonged there. There was nothing loud about her presence. No sharp movement. Just a quiet certainty that settled into the space around her, softer than Hawk's, but just as undeniable. Bella. Milan knew without being told. He felt it before he understood it. The name that had never been spoken in this house, but had always been there, in the untouched room upstairs, in the careful order of things, in the quiet absence that had never really felt empty until now. She closed the car door gently, her gaze lifting toward the house, pausing like it was something familiar she had been away from too long. Milan forced himself to breathe, slow and controlled, his fingers tightening slightly against the counter. Hawk stepped into view a second later. He didn't hesitate. He walked toward her like the distance between them didn't matter. Milan couldn't hear what they said. The glass softened everything, turned their voices into something indistinct, but he didn't need the words. He could see enough. The way Hawk stopped in front of her, the way Bella looked up at him, calm, familiar, like she had every right to be there. Something tightened in Milan's chest, sharper now, more defined. He stepped back instinctively, out of view, his breath uneven, his thoughts catching up too quickly. The room upstairs, the untouched sheets, the careful preparation. It had never been empty. It had been waiting. For her. The sound of the door opening broke the moment. Milan turned too slowly, caught off guard as Hawk stepped inside. Bella just behind him. The air changed immediately. Not louder, not heavier, just different. Milan. Hawk's voice pulled him forward, steady, but it didn't settle the way it usually did. Milan stepped into view, his movements controlled, his expression carefully neutral. Hawk glanced at him briefly, then at Bella. "This is Milan." The introduction was simple, nothing more than necessary. Bella's gaze moved to him, and for a moment, Milan felt like he was being seen too clearly. Not judged, not dismissed, just understood. It made it worse. "Hi," she said softly. Milan nodded slightly, his throat too tight to respond properly. "Hello." His voice came out quieter than he intended. Hawk moved past them both, like the moment didn't require explanation. Bella stepped further into the house, her eyes drifting briefly around the space, not searching, just recognizing. Milan watched her without meaning to, the way she moved, the way she fit into the space without effort, like she belonged here. His hand drifted to his abdomen again, but it didn't steady him this time. It only reminded him of something else, something that didn't fit here. "I came back sooner than I thought," Bella said quietly, her gaze shifting toward Hawk. Hawk nodded once, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the space between them, something familiar, something already there long before Milan had arrived. Milan looked away. He didn't need to see more. He already understood enough. The room upstairs, the one that wasn't his. It had never been empty. It had been waiting. And now, it didn't need to wait anymore. Milan stepped back slightly, his movements small, controlled, his expression still calm even as something inside him settled into place, cold and certain. He had known from the beginning. He had just chosen not to see it. This had never been his place. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. His fingers tightened briefly against his shirt, his breath catching for just a second before he forced it steady again. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since he arrived, the truth was clear. He hadn't been chosen. He had been filling a space. The worst part wasn't what I saw. It was what I didn't hear. Milan didn't mean to listen. He told himself that as he stood halfway up the stairs, his hand resting lightly against the railing, his steps slowing the moment he heard their voices below. It wasn't loud. Nothing in this house ever was. But it carried just enough to reach him, just enough to make him stop without realizing it. He could have gone back to his room. He should have. But he didn't move. Bella's voice came first, soft, familiar in a way that didn't belong to him. "I didn't think you'd actually keep everything the same." There was a pause. Milan's breath caught, his fingers tightening slightly against the wood beneath his hand. Hawk answered, his voice lower, steady as always. It didn't need to change. Simple, direct, but something in it settled heavier than it should have. Milan's chest tightened, his thoughts shifting too quickly, filling in meaning where there might not have been any. He stayed where he was, unmoving, caught between the instinct to leave and the need to understand something he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. "You always do that," Bella said quietly. "Hold on to things longer than you should." There was no accusation in her tone, no edge, just something softer. Familiar. Milan swallowed, his gaze dropping slightly, his body still refusing to move. Hawk didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of something Milan couldn't see, something that existed between them without needing to be explained. "You came back," Hawk said finally. Not questioning, not surprised, just stating it. Bella let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh. "I told you I would." Another pause. Milan's heart beat louder now, each word settling deeper than it should have, his thoughts building something solid out of fragments he didn't fully understand. "I wasn't." "Sure," Hawk admitted. It was subtle, almost nothing, but it was the first time Milan had heard something like that in his voice. Not uncertainty exactly, but something close to it. Something that didn't belong to the version of Hawk he had come to know. Bella's voice softened further. "You never are." Milan's grip tightened again, his breath uneven now, the space around him feeling smaller, heavier, like he was standing in something he shouldn't be hearing. "I didn't think you'd still be here," Bella continued. "After everything." Hawk didn't answer right away. The silence that followed stretched longer this time, thick with something Milan couldn't name. Then, quietly, "I said I would wait." The words landed harder than anything else. Milan's chest tightened sharply, his thoughts stalling for a second before rushing forward all at once. Wait. The room upstairs. The untouched sheets. The careful order. It all clicked into place too quickly, too clearly. Bella didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer, closer. "You shouldn't have." Not regret. Not quite. Just something else. Something that made Milan's stomach drop. It doesn't matter, Hawk said. The answer came too fast this time. Too final. Bella didn't argue. I'm here now, she said instead. And that was it. No explanation. No clarification. Just a statement that settled into the space like it had always been true. Milan stepped back before he realized he was moving, his breath uneven, his chest tight in a way that made it hard to think clearly. He didn't need to hear more. He had already heard enough. Everything he hadn't understood before suddenly made sense in a way that left no room for doubt. The room upstairs hadn't been empty. It had been waiting. Hawk hadn't been distant. He had been holding on to something else. Something that had nothing to do with Milan. Milan turned slowly, his steps quieter now, more controlled, as he moved back down the hallway, away from the voices, away from something he wasn't meant to be part of. His hand drifted to his abdomen again, pressing lightly, protectively, the motion grounding him just enough to keep moving. It didn't hurt. Not the way he expected. It was worse than that. It was clarity. By the time he reached his room, his thoughts had settled into something steady, something cold and certain. He closed the door softly behind him, the sound barely there, but it marked something all the same. Milan stood there for a moment, his gaze drifting across the room, the bed, the things that had never belonged to him, the space that had always been meant for someone else. He understood now, not just what he had walked into, but what he had allowed himself to believe. And that was the part that hurt the most. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly against his shirt, his other hand still resting where it had been more often lately, where it mattered now more than anything else. I shouldn't have stayed, he murmured under his breath. The words didn't break. They settled. Quiet. Final. And for the first time since Bella walked through the door, Milan stopped hoping he had misunderstood anything at all. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I finally understood I never had the right to stay. The words he had overheard didn't repeat in his head all at once. They settled slowly, quietly, like everything else had. I said I would wait. I'm here now. Milan didn't need to hear anything else. He had already understood what that meant. Hawk had been waiting, just not for him. And now, he didn't have to anymore. The house felt different after that. Not because anything had changed, but because he had. Every room held a clarity that hadn't been there before. Every silence filled with something he could finally name. He moved through it carefully, the same way he always had, but now every step felt measured, like he was already preparing to leave before admitting it to himself. Bella's presence didn't disrupt the house. It completed it. That was the part Milan couldn't ignore. She fit into the spaces that had never belonged to him, into the quiet patterns that had once felt unfamiliar but had slowly become something he relied on. Watching it happen didn't hurt the way he expected. It didn't break him all at once. It just confirmed everything he had already begun to understand. Hawk didn't explain. He didn't need to. He moved the same way he always did, steady, controlled, but now there were small shifts Milan couldn't unsee. The way he paused when Bella spoke. The way his attention lingered a second longer than necessary. The way the space between them felt known. Established. Like Milan had stepped into something already in progress. Milan stayed quiet. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give himself the space to. Because asking meant expecting something in return. And he had already learned better than that. That night, the house was quieter than usual. Not empty. Not tense. Just settled. Milan stood in the room upstairs, the one that had never been his fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the blanket he had slept in for days now. It was still smooth, still untouched in the way it had been before him, like his presence had never really changed it, like it was waiting to return to what it had always been. He exhaled slowly, his hand drifting to his abdomen, grounding, but not enough to steady the thoughts forming beneath it. If he stayed, nothing would change. It would just continue, quietly, with him standing at the edge of something that was never meant for him. And this time, it wasn't just about him anymore. That was the part that made the decision clear. Milan moved slowly, deliberately, pulling a small bag from the corner of the room. The one thing he had brought with him, the only thing that was truly his. He didn't have much to pack. That made it easier. Or maybe harder. Each movement felt heavier than it should have, his fingers slower, more careful, like if he rushed, he might stop himself. Downstairs, he could hear faint voices again. Bella's, soft and steady. Hawk's, lower, quieter in a way Milan hadn't heard before. He didn't listen closely. He didn't need to. The sound alone was enough. Milan zipped the bag closed, the soft sound final in a way nothing else had been. He stood there for a moment longer, his gaze moving around the room one last time, taking in the details he had memorized without realizing it. The bed, the lamp, the quiet stillness that had never truly belonged to him. Not mine, he murmured under his breath. This time he believed it. He stepped out into the hallway, his movements quiet, controlled, barely making a sound as he made his way down the stairs. Each step felt heavier, not because he wanted to stay, but because leaving meant acknowledging what he had allowed himself to feel, and what he had never been meant to have. The voices downstairs faded as he moved closer, then stopped entirely, the silence returning just as he reached the bottom. Milan paused for a fraction of a second, his hand tightening around the strap of his bag, his breath catching before he forced it steady again. Then he moved. The front door was closer than he expected, or maybe it just felt that way now. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the handle, hesitating just long enough to feel the weight of the moment, of everything he was choosing without saying it out loud. He didn't look back. He couldn't, because if he did, he wasn't sure he would leave. The door opened quietly. The night air was cooler, sharper, the space outside wider than the house had ever felt. Milan stepped out without another thought, the door closing softly behind him with a quiet click that sounded final. And for the first time, no one stopped him. He walked without stopping, his steps steady despite the tightness in his chest, his hand resting protectively against his abdomen as the distance between him and the house grew with every step. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know how far he would get, but he knew exactly why he was leaving. Not because he didn't care, not because he wasn't wanted, but because this time, he wasn't the only one he had to protect. And somewhere behind him, in a house that had never been his, everything would continue exactly as it was meant to. Without him, the first night alone, I realized no one was coming for me. The thought didn't hit all at once. It settled slowly, like the cold that crept through Milan's clothes, through his skin, until it reached something deeper he couldn't ignore. He kept walking anyway. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty and indifferent, the faint rush of distant cars reminding him the world was still moving somewhere else. Just not here. Not with him. His hand stayed pressed against his abdomen, steady, protective, the only thing anchoring him as his body began to slow. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't turn back. By the time the sky darkened completely, the exhaustion had caught up to him, his steps uneven, his breath shallow as each movement demanded more than the last. The first place he found was barely a place at all. A gas station at the edge of the road, its flickering lights casting a dull glow over cracked pavement and empty space. Milan stopped just outside it, his fingers tightening around the strap of his bag as he tried to steady himself. He didn't belong here, but he didn't belong anywhere else either. He stepped inside. The bell above the door rang softly, the warmth hitting him all at once, almost disorienting after the cold. The man behind the counter barely glanced at him before looking away again. No questions, no concern, just indifference. Milan moved slowly through the aisles, his gaze low, his thoughts scattered. He didn't have much money. He knew that before he even checked. Enough for something small. Enough to last the night. Maybe. He reached for a bottle of water, then hesitated at the cheapest food he could find, his fingers hovering for a second too long before picking it up. When he reached the counter, he placed everything down carefully. The total came. Milan paused. It was more than he expected. Just slightly, but enough. His fingers tightened around the few bills in his hand, his chest tightening with them. "That's all I have," he said quietly, his voice lower than he intended. The man behind the counter didn't look at him for long, just long enough to understand. Then he shrugged, reaching over and removing the food item from the counter, pushing it aside without a word. "Water's fine." Simple. Dismissive. Final. Milan nodded, even though something in his chest twisted, small and sharp. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He took the water and stepped back outside, the cold hitting him harder this time, sharper after the brief warmth he couldn't afford to keep. He sat on the edge of the curb, the rough concrete pressing through his clothes, the bottle still cool in his hand. He opened it slowly, taking a careful sip, his throat tightening as his body reacted to it like it had been waiting too long. His stomach twisted faintly, empty now, the absence of food more noticeable than before. Milan pulled his jacket closer around himself, his shoulders curling inward, his hand returning to his abdomen, resting there, grounding, protective. "It's okay," he murmured under his breath. The words didn't sound real, but he said them anyway, because there was no one else who would. The night stretched on, quiet and endless, the flickering light above him buzzing faintly, the only constant in a space that felt too wide, too empty. Milan leaned back slightly, his body heavy now, the exhaustion pressing down harder with every passing minute. Sleep came in fragments. Short, uneven, never enough. Every sound pulled him back, every shift of the cold reminding him where he was. Morning didn't bring warmth, just light, pale and distant. Milan woke slowly, his body stiff, his head heavy, his breath shallow as he pushed himself upright. For a moment, he didn't move. He just sat there, his hand already resting where it had been all night, checking, grounding, reminding himself why he couldn't stop now. He stood carefully, his balance unsteady for a second before it settled again. The road stretched ahead, unchanged, endless, empty. He picked up his bag, his fingers tightening around the strap as he pulled it over his shoulder. He didn't look back at the station. There was nothing there for him. There never had been. He stepped forward again, slower this time, more aware of the weight he carried, of the quiet responsibility that had shifted everything without asking. The wind cut through him, colder than before, but he didn't stop. Because now it wasn't just about getting through the night. It was about everything that came after. And this time, if he stopped, no one would notice. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked back into that house, because it felt empty in a way it never had before. Hawk didn't rush at first. He wasn't the kind of person who reacted without thinking, who let instinct override control. But something had been off since the moment he stepped back inside. Something subtle but undeniable, like a shift in the air that didn't belong. Bella was saying something behind him, her voice soft, familiar, but he didn't catch the words. His attention had already moved past it, scanning the space without meaning to, noticing what wasn't there instead of what was. Hawk. He didn't answer. His gaze moved across the room once, slow, deliberate, then again, sharper this time. The kitchen was the same. The table, the chair, nothing out of place. And yet, where is he? The question came out before he decided to ask it. Bella paused. Milan. Hawk didn't wait for the answer. He was already moving. The stairs creaked under his weight as he took them two at a time, faster than he should have, faster than he ever did. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly open. That was the first thing he noticed. The second was the stillness inside. He pushed the door open fully. The room was empty. Not just quiet. Not just still. Empty in a way that felt wrong. The bed was made. Too neat. Too untouched. Like no one had been there at all. Hawk stepped inside slowly, his gaze moving across the space, taking in details without missing anything. The closet, partially open. Fewer things than before. The corner where Milan had left his bag. Gone. Something in his chest tightened, sharp and immediate, a reaction that came too fast to ignore. No, it wasn't loud, but it was certain. Hawk turned quickly, already moving again, his steps heavier now, more urgent as he headed back downstairs. Bella was still there, standing where he had left her, her expression shifting the moment she saw his face. What happened? Hawk didn't slow down. He's gone. The words landed hard, heavier than they should have, sharper than he expected. Bella's brows drew together slightly. Gone? Where would he? Hawk was already at the door. It was closed. Of course it was. He reached for the handle, pulling it open, stepping outside like the answer might be there waiting for him. It wasn't. Just the same empty stretch of road. The same quiet. The same absence. Hawk stood there for half a second, his jaw tightening as something settled into place, something he hadn't allowed himself to consider until now. He had left. Not by accident. Not by confusion. On purpose. How long? Hawk muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. His gaze shifted, scanning the ground, the path, the space beyond it, looking for something, anything that would tell him when. Bella stepped up behind him, quieter this time. Hawk, what happened? He didn't answer immediately, because the truth was already forming, already connecting pieces he hadn't realized were there. Milan's silence. The way he had been watching. The way he had stopped asking questions. And then, Bella. The timing. The conversation. Hawk's grip tightened slightly against the doorframe, his mind replaying everything with a clarity that hadn't been there before. He heard something, Hawk said finally. Bella stilled. He misunderstood. The words came slower now. He knew it the second he said them. Not because Milan had told him, but because it was the only explanation that fit. The only thing that made sense. Bella's expression shifted, concern settling deeper. What did he hear? Hawk exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on the empty road. Enough. The answer was quiet, but it carried weight. He stepped forward then, off the porch, his eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the direction Milan must have taken without needing confirmation. There was only one way he would have gone. Away. Always away. He shouldn't have left. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something sharper. Something heavier. Bella watched him for a moment, then said softly, "You didn't tell him anything." Hawk didn't respond. Because she wasn't wrong. He hadn't explained. He hadn't clarified. He hadn't thought he needed to. That was his mistake. He had assumed Milan would stay. The realization settled hard, heavier than anything else had. Hawk turned back toward the house briefly, his gaze flicking toward the stairs, toward the room that had never really been Milan's, but had become something anyway. Something he hadn't defined. Something he hadn't acknowledged in time. Then he looked back at the road. Decision settled in without hesitation. I'm going after him. Bella didn't stop him. She didn't argue. She just nodded once, her expression unreadable but steady. You should. Hawk didn't wait. He moved immediately, his steps faster now, more direct, already calculating distance, time, direction. Milan hadn't had a head start long enough to disappear completely. Not yet. Not if Hawk moved now. But as he stepped further down the road, one thought settled into place, sharper than the rest, heavier than anything he had allowed himself to feel before. Milan hadn't left because he wanted to. He had left because he thought he had to. And that meant one thing. Hawk had let him believe it. For 3 years, I never stopped looking for him. I just didn't know where to find him until now. Milan didn't hesitate. The moment his eyes met mine, something in him snapped into place. Not recognition, not relief, but instinct. His arms tightened immediately around the child, pulling him closer, his body turning before his mind could catch up. Then he moved. Not fast. He couldn't be. 3 years had worn him down in ways distance couldn't hide, in the way his steps dragged just slightly, in the way his balance shifted under weight he never set down. But the intention was clear. Get away. Protect. Don't lose this too. I moved after him without thinking. Not reckless. Not careless. But fast enough to close the space before he could push himself any further. Milan, he stumbled. Just enough. His footing slipped under him, his body tilting forward as his grip tightened around the child, instinct overriding everything else. I reached him in the next second, my hand catching his arm, steadying him before he could fall. Don't, he said immediately, his voice sharp despite the exhaustion underneath, his body twisting away, turning his back slightly to shield the child completely. Don't touch me. I loosened my hold instantly, enough to show I wasn't restraining him, but stayed close enough to keep him upright if he lost his balance again. You're not taking him. The words came out stronger this time. Not just fear. A line drawn after everything he had survived. His arms tightened again around the child, his entire body curving protectively, like he would break himself before letting anything reach him. I didn't move closer. Didn't reach for the child. Didn't even look at him for more than a second. This wasn't about him. Not yet. I'm not here to take anything from you, I said, my voice low, steady, controlled in a way that left no room for doubt. He didn't answer. His breathing was uneven, his eyes sharp, watching every movement like he was waiting for me to prove him right. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay exactly where I was, not closing the space, not pushing past the boundary he had set. I know why you ran, I continued. And you were wrong. His grip faltered, just for a second, enough to tell me he was still listening. You heard part of it, I said. Not all of it. He shook his head faintly, his voice strained. It was enough. No, I said, firmer now. It wasn't. The certainty didn't come from emotion. It came from knowing exactly what I had let happen. I took one step closer, then stopped, close enough for him to see me clearly, not close enough to make him retreat again. I didn't wait for her the way you think, I said, each word deliberate. And I didn't keep you there to replace anything. His eyes flickered, uncertainty breaking through the fear for the first time, but it didn't last. Then what was I? He asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. I didn't hesitate. Mine. Not possession. Not control. Just truth. His breath caught, his arms tightening again around the child, like he didn't know what to do with something he had never been allowed to believe. I held his gaze. You left because you thought you didn't matter, I said. That's on me. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Fragile. He didn't argue, but he didn't lower his guard either. I stepped closer again. Slowly. letting him see every movement, letting him decide if he wanted to run again. He didn't. You kept him safe, I said quietly, my eyes dropping briefly to the child before returning to him. You did everything right. His shoulders dropped just slightly, the words hitting somewhere deeper than the fear. I stopped in front of him, close, but still not touching. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. He didn't answer. His grip didn't loosen. But he didn't step back either. And for the first time since he ran, he stopped trying to escape. You said you were fine, but I already knew what that word meant when you said it. 3 years later, the silence between them felt different. Not empty, not distant, just full of things that hadn't been said yet. Milan sat near the window, the child resting quietly in his arms, his hand moving absent-mindedly over the small back in a slow, steady rhythm. He looked calmer here, safer, but not untouched. That part hadn't changed. Hawk stood a few steps away, watching him, not interrupting, not stepping too close. Not yet. How was it? Hawk asked finally, his voice low, controlled. Milan didn't look up. What? After you left. The question stayed simple, direct. Milan adjusted the blanket slightly, his movements practiced, automatic. It was fine, he said. We managed. Hawk didn't respond immediately. He just watched him, the way his fingers lingered a second longer than needed, the way his shoulders never fully relaxed. Fine, Hawk repeated quietly. Milan nodded faintly. Yeah, it wasn't that bad. The lie was smooth, clean, familiar. Hawk took a step closer. Not enough to crowd him. Just enough that Milan couldn't pretend he hadn't heard. You didn't need, Hawk said. Milan stilled, just for a second, then continued adjusting the blanket like nothing had changed. I did. You didn't sleep. No answer. Hawk's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed even. You stood in a gas station counting coins, trying to make it enough. Milan's hand stopped completely this time. The silence shifted. He looked up slowly. You checked. I had to. Hawk's gaze didn't waver. Because you weren't going to tell me. Milan looked away first. His arms tightened slightly around the child, instinctive, grounding. It doesn't matter, he said quietly. We're here now. Hawk shook his head once. It does. Milan didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. His gaze dropped back to the child, his hand moving again, slower now. He was fine, Milan said after a moment. That's all that matters. Hawk stepped closer. Just one more step. Enough that the distance between them wasn't protection anymore. You showed up somewhere you shouldn't have been alone, Hawk continued, his voice lower now, heavier. They said you could barely stand. Milan's fingers tightened faintly against the blanket. I was okay. You weren't. Hawk didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You went through that alone. The words hung in the air. Sharp. Unavoidable. Milan swallowed, his throat tightening slightly, but he didn't look up. It worked out. Hawk exhaled slowly, the control in his posture tightening instead of breaking. You almost didn't make it, he said. And you still didn't let go of him. Milan's arms instinctively pulled the child closer, like even now, that moment hadn't fully passed. He needed me, Milan said quietly. Hawk's gaze dropped briefly to the child, then back to Milan. And you needed someone too. Milan didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. The silence said it for him. Hawk's jaw tightened, something sharper breaking through the control he had been holding onto this entire time. You didn't need, he repeated. But he did. Milan's breath hitched faintly, just enough to give him away. Hawk stepped closer again. This time, close enough that there was no distance left to hide behind. You gave him everything, Hawk said, his voice rougher now, quieter, like it cost him something to say it out loud. Everything I didn't give. You. Milan's fingers curled slightly into the fabric of the blanket, his gaze dropping further, like the words had found something he hadn't meant to expose. You left because you thought you didn't matter, Hawk continued, his voice steady again, but heavier now. Because I didn't make it clear enough that you did. Milan shook his head faintly, his voice soft. I made that choice. You shouldn't have had to. The answer came immediately. No hesitation. No doubt. Milan finally looked up then, his eyes meeting Hawk's, searching for something. Something he hadn't allowed himself to believe before. Hawk held his gaze. I should have told you, he said. I should have made you stay. A pause. Then, quieter. I should have found you sooner. The words settled deep, heavier than anything else. Milan's expression shifted slightly, something softer breaking through the guarded calm he had been holding on to. But you found us, Milan said quietly. That's what matters. Hawk didn't answer right away, because it wasn't enough. Not for what had already happened. Not for what Milan had gone through alone. But Milan didn't look away this time. His hold on the child was still firm, still protective, but not as tight as before. We're still here, Milan added softly. Both of us. The words were simple, but they carried everything. Survival, loss, choice. Hawk's gaze dropped briefly to the child, then lifted back to Milan. This time, there was no distance left between them. And for the first time since everything had broken apart, neither of them tried to step away. I used to think I had to hold everything together by myself, until I realized I wasn't the only one reaching anymore. It didn't change all at once. Nothing between them ever did. It showed up in small, quiet shifts that stayed long enough to matter. Milan noticed it in the way Hawk moved around him now. Slower, more deliberate, like every step was chosen, not to take space, but to share it. The house felt different too. Not because the walls had changed, but because Milan no longer stood at the edge of them. He moved through it now, the small weight in his arms shifting as the child stirred, no longer fragile in the same way, but still held just as carefully. At 2 years old, he wasn't quiet anymore. He reached. He grabbed. He laughed. At things that didn't make sense, like the world had never given him a reason to be afraid of it. The first time it happened, Milan almost missed how much it meant. The child shifted in his arms, small hands pressing against his chest before turning outward, curious, restless. Hawk stood a step away, not moving, not reaching, giving space the way he always did now. The child noticed him first. Of course he did. Small fingers opened, reaching without hesitation, without fear, towards something new. Milan stilled. His grip tightened instinctively for half a second, then stopped. Hawk didn't move closer, didn't assume. His hand lifted slightly, then paused, leaving the distance untouched. The child leaned forward, impatient, a soft sound leaving him, not distressed, just wanting. Milan looked down at him, then back at Hawk. That familiar hesitation flickered, but didn't stay. Slowly, carefully, Milan shifted his hold, not giving him away, just allowing the space. Hawk stepped in then, only as much as he needed to. His hands were steady when he took the child, practiced not from experience, but from attention. The child didn't resist. He settled almost immediately, small fingers gripping lightly at Hawk's shirt, his head tilting as he studied him with open curiosity. Then he laughed, soft at first, then louder, like he had already decided Hawk belonged there. Milan felt something in his chest give, not breaking, not falling apart, but loosening in a way he hadn't allowed before. Hawk adjusted his hold instinctively when the child shifted again, supporting him without hesitation, like he had already decided this was something he wouldn't get wrong. Hey, Hawk murmured, his voice lower now, careful in a way that didn't come from uncertainty, but from choice. The child answered with another small sound, one hand still gripping Hawk's shirt, the other reaching back toward Milan, like he didn't understand separation, only connection. Milan stepped closer this time without thinking. His hand met the child's first, then Hawk's, fingers brushing, then staying. No tension, no instinct to pull away, just contact. Real, simple, enough. Hawk looked up then, meeting Milan's gaze without hesitation. He's ours, he said quietly. Not claiming, not taking, just acknowledging something that had already been built, piece by piece, without him, and something he was choosing now to protect. Milan's breath caught faintly, his fingers tightening for a moment before slowly easing again, like he was still learning how to accept something he had never been given before. Hawk shifted slightly, stepping closer, not taking space, but standing in it with him. I should have been there, Hawk said, his voice steady, but heavier now. For all of it. Milan held his gaze, something softer settling in his expression, something that didn't need to be guarded the way it used to. But you're here now, he said quietly. Hawk nodded once, not as an answer, as a promise. The child shifted again between them, laughing softly at nothing in particular, his small body leaning easily from one to the other, like he had already decided there was no distance left to cross. Milan didn't hesitate this time. He didn't hold back. His shoulder brushed lightly against Hawk's, his presence no longer something he kept at the edge. Hawk's hand adjusted slightly, steady, grounding, close enough to be felt without taking control. We'll figure it out, Hawk said quietly. Together. Milan exhaled slowly, the weight he had carried no longer something he held alone. His hand rested lightly against the child again, but it wasn't the only one there. And when the child shifted closer, pressing between them, holding on to both without question, Milan didn't brace himself for it to be taken away. He didn't pull back. He stayed. And this time, he wasn't the only one holding on. He was being held too. It wasn't the noise that scared them anymore. It was the silence after. The first time it happened, it was late. Not the kind of late that felt peaceful, but the kind that stretched too long, where the house settled into stillness, and every small sound felt louder than it should. Milan woke up before he realized he had. His body reacted first, tense, alert, breath already shallow like something was wrong. He didn't move right away. He listened. That habit hadn't left him. It probably never would. Beside him, the child shifted in his sleep, a small, restless movement, fingers curling instinctively into the fabric of Milan's shirt like he needed to anchor himself to something real. Milan's hand came up immediately, steadying him, his palm resting lightly over the small back, counting the rhythm of his breathing without thinking. It was fine. Everything was fine, but his chest didn't believe it yet. Across the room, a floorboard creaked. Just once. Quiet. Normal. But it was enough. Milan's body tightened instantly, his shoulders pulling in, his breath catching before he could stop it. The child stirred again, reacting to the shift, a soft sound leaving him, not fully awake, but not settled either. Milan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay still, to not let it become something bigger. He had done this before. Many times. Just wait. Just listen. Just get through it. The door opened quietly. Not sudden. Not forced. Just enough to let a sliver of light slip into the room. Hawk didn't speak right away. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't turn the light on fully. He just stood there for a second, taking in the room, the tension, the way Milan hadn't moved, but wasn't resting either. Then he stepped in. Slow. Measured. The floor didn't creak this time. Milan noticed that. Of course he did. Hawk stopped near the bed, not too close, not crowding, just within reach. It's just me, he said quietly. Not loud. Not sudden. Just enough to be heard. Milan didn't answer, but his shoulders dropped, just slightly. Hawk didn't push. He moved closer after a second, sitting on the edge of the bed without disturbing the space Milan had created around the child. The mattress dipped just enough to be felt, but not enough to shift anything. The child stirred again, then settled, his small hand loosening slightly where it had been gripping Milan's shirt. Hawk's hand rested nearby. Not touching. Not yet. Just there. Present. Steady. You don't have to stay awake for it, Hawk said quietly. Milan let out a slow breath, his fingers still resting protectively against the child, like letting go wasn't something his body knew how to do yet. I'm not, Milan said softly. But the words didn't match the tension still held in his shoulders. Hawk didn't call it out. He just stayed. A few seconds passed. Then a minute. Nothing happened. No second sound. No interruption. Just quiet. The kind that didn't carry danger anymore. Just time passing. Hawk shifted slightly, his hand moving just enough to rest lightly over Milan's where it lay on the child's back. Not replacing it. Not taking over. Just covering it. Warm. Steady. Real. Milan didn't pull away. His breath hitched faintly at the contact, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, but he didn't move. Hawk didn't tighten his grip. Didn't hold him there. He just stayed like that. After a moment, Milan's fingers relaxed. Just a little. The child's breathing evened out completely now, small chest rising and falling without interruption, no longer reacting to tension that wasn't there anymore. Milan closed his eyes briefly, not fully resting, but no longer searching. It's quiet, Hawk said after a while. Not pointing it out. Just stating it. Milan nodded faintly. Yeah. Hawk's thumb moved slightly, barely brushing against Milan's hand, not enough to distract, just enough to remind him something else was there. And it's going to stay that way, Hawk added. Not a promise made loudly. Not something dramatic. Just something steady enough to believe in over time. Milan didn't answer, but his body did. The tension eased. Not gone. Not completely. But enough. Enough that his breathing slowed. Enough that his hand didn't tighten again when the silence stretched longer. Enough that he didn't wait for something to break it. Hawk didn't move away. He didn't need to. He stayed there, exactly where he was, until the stillness stopped feeling like something they had to survive and started feeling like something they could rest in. And when Milan finally drifted off again, his hand still resting where it had been, but no longer holding on like he couldn't let go, Hawk didn't move. He just stayed. Because this time, the silence didn't belong to fear anymore. It belonged to them. 2 years ago, there was no one there to tell me it would be okay. The storm came down heavy, pressing against the thin walls of the abandoned roadside shed like it was trying to break through, the wind slipping through every crack, every gap, carrying cold that settled deep into Milan's bones. He sat on the floor with his back against the rough wood, breath uneven, hands trembling despite how tightly he tried to steady them. He had known this moment would come. He just hadn't known it would come like this, alone, unprepared, with nothing but instinct and sheer will holding him together. Another wave hit, pulling a sharp breath from him as his body curled forward, one hand gripping his shirt, the other pressed protectively against his abdomen like he could shield what was happening from the world outside. "It's okay," he whispered, but the words barely formed, breaking apart before they could mean anything. There was no one to hear them, no one to answer. Only the storm, loud and indifferent, and the silence inside that felt even heavier. Time didn't move the way it should. It stretched, fractured, each second dragging into the next until all that remained was the space between breaths, between fear and the fragile determination that refused to let him stop. Milan lowered his head, pressing his forehead against his arm, his body shaking as his thoughts narrowed to one thing, one reason he couldn't fall apart. "Stay with me," he murmured, softer now, steadier despite everything, like he was anchoring himself to something that hadn't even taken its first breath yet. When it finally happened, it wasn't marked by anything loud or clear, just a shift, a change in the air, a breath that wasn't his. Milan stilled completely, his body going rigid as his hands trembled, afraid to move too quickly, afraid it wasn't real. Then it came again, small, fragile, alive. Something in his chest gave way, not breaking, not collapsing, but opening in a way that left him breathless. "Hey," he whispered, his voice shaking now, his hands moving instinctively, carefully, pulling the small body close, wrapping him in what little warmth he had, shielding him from everything the world had already been. "I've got you." The words came stronger this time, not because they were certain, but because they had to be. He held him there, steady despite the tremor in his body, his breath uneven but grounding, refusing to let go, refusing to fail the only thing that had ever been his. There was no one else. There had never been. But he wasn't alone anymore. And that was enough to survive the night. This time he wasn't alone. The room was warm, steady, filled with quiet that didn't press in, didn't threaten, didn't need to be endured. Milan's breath hitched as the familiar wave came, his fingers tightening instinctively. But this time, before the fear could settle, there was something already there. A hand, firm, certain, holding his. "I'm right here." Hawk's voice was low, grounded, not distant, not late, just present in a way Milan had never known in a moment like this. Milan's grip tightened, not out of fear, but recognition, the contact real, solid, something he didn't have to question. Another wave came, stronger, and his breath broke slightly, but he didn't fold inward. He leaned, just enough. Hawk steadied him without hesitation, one hand anchoring his, the other at his back, firm and unwavering, not taking control, just making sure he didn't have to carry it alone. "You're doing fine," Hawk said quietly, not because it was easy, but because he was there to see it through with him. Time moved differently now, not fractured, not endless, just forward. When the sound came this time, it filled the space instead of breaking it, clear, certain, alive. Milan stilled, his breath catching as everything settled into place, his hands trembling not from fear, but from something fuller, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. "He's here," Hawk said softly, not distant, not unsure. Milan exhaled slowly, his head lowering for a second before lifting again, his eyes searching, needing to see, needing to believe. And when the child was placed in his arms, Milan didn't hesitate. His hands moved with certainty, holding him close, steady, sure, not just surviving, but knowing. The child made a small sound, stronger now, safe, held in something that didn't break. Hawk's hand remained at his back, a quiet presence, unshaken, constant. Milan looked up, meeting his gaze, something unspoken settling between them. Not fragile, not uncertain, just true. "We've got him," Hawk said. And this time, Milan didn't whisper that it was just them. His hand rested over the child, but it wasn't the only one there. The weight he carried wasn't his alone. The silence didn't belong to fear. And as the child settled, warm and steady between them, Milan felt it fully for the first time. Not survival, not endurance, but something else entirely. Something that stayed. Because this time, He wasn't the only one holding on. He was being held too.